Welcome back to Vanilla Swirl Developer Commentary with your host. It's me, Dr. Brian Lorgon 111. Hello. And I have a lot of topics that I want to cover today, so let's just get right to it. And the first one is lore. It is the case that a lot of CTM maps these days and a lot of adventure maps and different things have a lot of lore, which is story. There's a backstory. The player crash landed their spaceship on this crazy world and they're trying to survive, or they were shipwrecked on a desert island, or, some evil someone took over the earth and you need to restore peace to the whatever, blah, blah, blah. And then oftentimes there'll be different books or signs in different areas that tell you about the area, tell you the history. You'll have certain, weapons that are, it's not an iron sword, it's the hammer of Thor or whatever that goes with the kind of whole world building and lore and story. And I'm personally not interested in that. I know some people really are. I am not one of those people. I don't think I could write a good kind of like story and lore for one of these maps. And it's just not something that interests me. And I often find also that when people do Let's Plays of maps, it's often the case that both just because either people aren't interested and also the way that oftentimes text works or fails to work in Minecraft, it could be hard to, communicate a story during a Let's Play. And so, yes, I've chosen not to do any lore. There's no backstory. There's no silly item names for the most part. There's like 3 or 4 named items in here, such as the mysterious divining rod. But for the most part, I'm avoiding all of that. And so that's just a design choice that I chose to make, both because I don't like it and because I don't think I would be able to implement it very well if I tried. Now let's talk about loot. The loots! There are a lot of loot chests in this map, and I think loot and the way you give out loot is one of the most important mechanical aspects of a CTM map. You want to gear the player, you want to have the player feel like they're getting rewarded for the places that they're exploring and any puzzles they're solving and monsters they're fighting and that kind of stuff. And yeah, in terms of my overall philosophy with Minecraft, I don't like to force people to play a certain way, and so I want to give them options, and so I've tried to do that in this map. It comes with various trade-offs. And yeah, let's just talk about a few aspects of that. I actually talk about this explicitly in the starter book and kind of like overview rules. But for example, I give lots and lots of enchanted books and anvils in this map. And I explicitly tell people that they don't have to go mining for diamonds and make an enchanting table, but they can if they want to. And if you go down into the cave systems, I suppose it'd be easier if I were holding this so I can have night vision. If we go down into cave systems, I don't know that we're immediately going to find any or whatever, but there are diamonds, in the ground. I think they might be slightly less rare than they are in a normal vanilla map, but you can find diamonds just by mining underground. And so if the player is struggling in the map, and despite whatever loot they're getting, like they're not able to, with the gear that I'm giving them, be able to tackle the mobs, they can always go down and mine some diamonds and make an enchanting table and, even, strip mine and make diamond armor if that's what they want to do. I want people to have those options, but at the same time, hopefully, for the majority, you can't, cater to everybody all the time or whatever because different players are at different skill levels. But I'm hoping that the majority of players won't need to leverage that, but I want players who do need that extra leverage to be able to get extra loot, get extra enchants and different things if they want to do so. And yeah, the books that I give people as rewards, there is a lot of variety, perhaps too much variety, but I really want people to get a chance to be able to choose their own gear sets so that when they're going up on the cobweb area that has lots of spiders and cave spiders and witches, they can choose to use, protection armor as opposed to blast protection armor because it seems like those are the mobs that they're going to be up against. And they could use Bane of Arthropods if they want in order to fight the spiders rather than a smite sword. I want to give people the opportunity to think strategically about the weapons and armors that they have, which means giving them choices that they can use in certain areas. But at the same point, it's a tension between giving people too much loot and too much choice because then they get overwhelmed and they have so many books. And in the playthrough that, Cthulhu and Circaz and I had, we had 4 double chests filled with all the different loot books that we eventually got that had like melee enchants and bow enchants and armor enchants and utility book enchants. from all these different enchanted books that you get in the loot throughout the map. And so there's a tension there between giving people the choices and having them be overwhelmed with too many choices and having too much loot. And some of that comes as a result of random generation, and I don't know exactly which way the player is going to go, and I don't know exactly what loot chests they're going to find, and so I want to make sure that any reasonable path they go through, they're at least going to get one of these chests and one of these chests, which is probably going to have, 2 different melee enchants. I've got a smite and a knockback and a sharpness in here, as well as different bow enchants and different things, so that people have some choices to work with. But in order to ensure that I give people enough choices without knowing where they're going, I kind of have to give them a little bit too much book loot. It's better now in the May versions of the map than it was in the original March versions of the map, where the loot was really overwhelming. I would say in March, the maps had an overwhelming amount of book loot. In May, they still give a lot of book loot, but it's been toned down. It could probably still be toned down a little bit more. This is something that I still haven't dialed in perfectly. And I think you can get just about every enchant in the game through the loot chests, although some things are more rare than others. But I try to make it possible for people to get all the different things, even though I kind of focus on certain enchants and have much other enchants that most people don't use be rarer. Another aspect about loot, I talked about the fact that people could go mining for diamonds if they were struggling and they needed to, just be able to gear up more because of their skill level, or maybe they died and lost their stuff. They needed to get more loot. There's a lot of other ways that you can get more loot in this map. For one, it's the fact that there's multiple versions of many dungeons. And so you saw perhaps in my playthrough with Cthulhu and Circaz, we didn't just tackle one green beacon, we tackled 2 of them. Because after one, in a 3-player multiplayer, we wanted to have a little bit more loot before we decided to move forward. And so we just went and tackled another green beacon in order to get a second copy of the green beacon loot chest. And there's multiple copies of just about every dungeon and every chest in this map, and so that is definitely a way that you could get more loot. And on top of that, once you have defeated the green beacon, which is the first monument block dungeon that you have to defeat, you will also get a loot finding kit, which will give you the bonus glass proximity detector. And this amazing device allows you to find the various loot chests that are hidden throughout the surface of the world. And so, for example, this hot brings me over to this chest over here, which contains some loot that could be useful. Blocks are always nice. The emeralds will be useful later on once we unlock teleporters, but there's a Protection 1 book, which is very useful early gear for armor, some more anvils to work with, and in this case, a brown stained glass bonus monument item, which causes this to no longer be hot because we've managed to get the loot out of this chest. But basically, this bonus glass proximity detector is something I added after the playthrough with Kurt that serves 2 purposes. One is it makes it possible to complete the bonus monument, as you saw with the playthrough that I did with Cthulhu and Circaz. Basically, it helps you find colors that you haven't found yet, so that you'll actually be able to, rather than just wander aimlessly across the map looking for these different items, you have some kind of direction where it tells you when you're getting warmer, and as a result allows you to locate the things, locate all the different colors. And so that was something that Kurt and I wouldn't have been able to do on our map, just because we just have to aimlessly wander and hope that we stumbled across things. And because this comes after the Green Beacon dungeon, it comes relatively early in the map. It means that if you are struggling with the Red Beacon, for example, you could just take a time out, and rather than trying to defeat the dungeon, you can just go explore the world and take advantage of this thing in order to find all the different loot chests and find extra enchanted books that'll help you out. Different blocks might help you out, and occasionally some of these chests have extra bonus loot inside of them. And yeah, let me go find an example of that. Here's another hidden chest, tall grass and an X with a little tulip that shouldn't be here. And inside here, oh look, there's an iron chestplate. And this is actually a new item that I added after my playthrough with Cthulhu and Circaz, but there are some spectral arrows, which are both for fun, as well as being a useful thing that you can use against the mobs. But that's an example of some gear that is found right outside the daylight area in spawn, and so if people went looking for extra loot, they could find extra things that would help them gear up relatively easily. And speaking of loot, let me get an example of a few random loot chests that one might find out in the world and open them up, because I just want to talk about a couple aspects of things. So I'm just going to place these chests. They're just coming out of the debug box that I have, and so they're just sample chests that one might find in the world in different locations. And I have them for debugging when I'm trying to make sure that my loot tables are working correctly. But basically, if we go and we take a look through these chests, one thing that you will notice from looking at these, wow, these were actually some pretty good chests in that batch there, is that there's always a certain order to the loot, and that order is constant across the chests, and things are not spread out the way that you often see them in other CTM maps. It's often the case that a particular chest that you'll open in a CTM map will have an iron sword with a good enchant somewhere in it, and then scattered about there'll be like leaf blocks and other kind of useless blocks that just kind of make a whole mishmash of ugliness in what's in the chest. And I don't like doing that because my least favorite minigame in Minecraft is called inventory management. And I think it's really not at all fun for the player to have to open up a chest and then try to figure out what are the good things and what are the useless things inside the chest, and figure out where they all are and try to, grab the good things out of the chest. So in all of my chests, things always go in the same order. At the end of the chest, there's always emeralds, books, anvils. Occasionally you get bonus items that are good items that come after that, such as these rare ender pearls. At the beginning of the chest, sometimes there's also bonus items that are food items, or armor is an example here, the iron chest plate. Or occasionally you also get what I call a booby prize. So things like a gold nugget, and in one of these chests, I don't think it was one of these 4 out here, it was just like a stack of 16 eggs or something. And then, yeah, mostly the chests contain things like blocks that are mostly, because these are random loot chests that are just scattered throughout the surface of the world and are relatively easy to obtain. While there are useful items like the emerald and the various enchanted books and the anvils, as well as the occasional good bonus prize like golden apples or ender pearls you might find in a chest. For the most part, the chest is about giving the player access to blocks that they might enjoy building with, and occasionally also have some utility as well. But when you go looking through here, it's building blocks. It's, when you're, again, I make many call outs to Legendary, but when you're in Legendary, like, Vex will give you a bunch of loot chests that just contain things like, glass and bricks and different things like that. And it's because it's Minecraft, and a lot of people really enjoy building a house and, making an exotic base and possibly even making a rail station to get them from here to there. And so I want to enable players to be able to do that in this map, especially in this map, because it does feel so much like vanilla Minecraft, and people might be like, oh, this is an awesome mesa. I love the overlook out onto the ocean, and this is exactly the type of place I would want to build a house in my survival world. And so if you want to take a break from doing dungeons, I want to give you the loot to do so. And I want to give it to you in a way that is very succinct and easy for you to visually parse what is inside these chests and be able to find the good stuff and not have it scattered all about, so that you have to go and try to pick up all the individual pieces or shift double click or all the different things that one needs to do. So I have chosen to do that. Another thing that you may notice in both chests, loot chests, as well as with mob drops, the food drops that I give, I specifically only give 5 types of food. I give cookies, I give apples, I give bread, I give steak, and I give golden apples. And those are the only food drops that I give in my map. And the reason is inventory management. In Minecraft, I don't understand why. You have the same number of inventory spaces. You have 36 inventory spaces, and then like your armor spaces or whatever. I guess we have 1 extra space now with the offhand. But it's the same number of spaces as Minecraft had, back when Minecraft was in alpha, and there were only 60 different items and blocks in alpha, and now there's over 500, or depending upon how you count, over 400 billion different items that you can obtain in Minecraft that wouldn't stack in your inventory. And so the player's inventory is relatively limited. And so I always find it silly in CTM maps where you'll, in the same area, you'll get a cooked fish and a piece of bread and a steak and a pork chop and all these different things. I guess maybe map makers are intending to clutter the player's inventory and make it hard for them to make choices about what to hold on to and what to drop. But my personal opinion is that is just stupid, because inventory management is not what's fun about Minecraft. It's fighting the mobs and exploring and finding secrets. That's what's fun about Minecraft. And I've actually gone and like done some measurements of watching people's Let's Plays and spending, 20% of your time in a CTM map on a screen where you're opening your chest and moving items from your inventory in and out of your inventory and in the chest does not make for a compelling video, as well as not being fun for the player, in my opinion. So basically, the way that I organize the loot and the loot chests is trying to tailor to the idea that I want people to not spend time inside loot chest organizing their inventory and instead grab the things that they want and be able to get back to playing the game. And that's also the reason that, unlike a lot of CTM maps, which say you can't, place or move ender chests, I say that you can. And indeed, I actually give ender chests as like custom loot in some of the dungeon loot boxes that I can't remember if there's one sitting around here, but I give an ender chest as well as a one-time use wooden pickaxe that has silk touch that allows you to pick up the ender chest, because I want to encourage players to use an ender chest, because inventory management is a problem because there aren't that many inventory slots for players. And when you're playing a big CTM map like this, even though there are affordances like teleporters in different portions of the map that we haven't talked about yet that allow people to have fast travel across the map, it's still the case that when you find good loot out in a loot chest and like you decide, oh, I want to build a rail system. Does one of these chests have rails in it? I can't remember. And so you want to take all of those rail things back to your house. Like, I want people to be able to use an ender chest in order to get that inventory back more easily. And so basically, I guess loot philosophy is, I want to give people good loot. I want to give them the option to build, but I also want to make it easy for them to manage their inventory. And so I try to do that both in the way that I present the loot in the chests, as well as giving people ender chests. Another thing about loot is that I give very little custom loot. Things like the infinitely seeing eye or the mysterious divining rod. I think there's like, I don't know, maybe like 6 different pieces of like name special loot that I give. And they have a couple things in common. One is that they're things that, you wouldn't normally obtain, but also they are, for the most part, I think all of them are not things that you use in combat. They are utility items that are used mostly as a result of being able to explore the map and find secrets and things like that. I see a lot of CTM maps that give lots of custom loot with, a sword. Let's say you have a piece of armor that has both protection and projectile protection, which is something that you normally couldn't get on it. Or a sword that when you're holding it, it gives you extra speed as an attribute, and so you can like run faster while you're holding the sword. And to some extent, I think that those items are very cool. And in future maps, I may include more of those items. But at the same time, a trade-off there is that maps that do that, I find, tend to have lots and lots of different items that all have different trade-offs, and there's lots of loot chests. And so you go and you fight through a little area and you break into this house and you find that there's a loot chest that has this sword, and so you grab this sword. And 4 minutes later, you've just fought your way through another building or whatever, and it's got a loot chest, and it's got a different sword that has some things that are kind of better than the sword that you just found, and some things that are not as good as the sword that you just found, perhaps. And then you get to thinking about, do I want to take this sword? Do I want to swap out my sword for this sword and leave it behind because I'm trying to manage my inventory? Blah, blah, blah. And a lot of times also it'll be like combinations of enchant that you normally can't get in survival, and so players might also not know how to value the thing. Is it better to have a chestplate that has, protection 1 and projectile protection 2? Or is it better just to have a chestplate that only has protection 2 on it? There are some obvious trade-offs in terms of the types of damage that it gives, but how much better is the projectile protection versus just having a higher level of normal protection against skeletons? These are fine details that the player is unlikely to know about, and I don't want to, force the player to have to make a lot of those decisions. And so instead, I'm trying to keep the loot simple in this map so that the player can very quickly make decisions about the types of gear that they want to do, and then just get that gear and run with it. Finally, in all the random loot chests around the map, they all contain emeralds. In single player, I think they all contain 1 or maybe 2 emeralds, and in multiplayer, they might contain a few more. And in the starter book at spawn, it tells you that you should hold on to your emeralds because you'll be able to use them later to obtain some useful buffs. And for those who have played the map or watched a playthrough or found crazy path blocks that seem to have a little arrow pointing in a direction and actually noticed that and managed to follow the arrow in a particular direction, it would eventually lead them to a teleporter. And where's the teleporter? Here's the teleporter. And when one goes through the teleporter, it will bring you back to spawn, a 2-way teleporter to and from spawn, which allows for fast travel, but also unlocks a villager, if Minecraft actually works and renders the villager, but it's not working right now. Let me relog. Here's the villager, and this guy is trading 4 emeralds for enduring strength. Strength 2 lasts until you die or drink milk, which is a very useful buff, but it's going to cost you some emeralds, which means you're going to need to have found a few loot chests in order to be able to pay for that. If you're in multiplayer, you need more emeralds for everybody, and if you've died along the way and lost the buff, you would need more emeralds to repurchase it. And so throughout the map, all of the kind of extra random loot that I have is mostly about rewarding exploration. Once again, I really enjoy the terrain generation. I enjoy exploring in this game, and I think just kind of like finding new places and hidden secrets is one of the things that makes CTM maps so much fun. And so even if you've gotten to the point to where you don't really need the loot anymore, it's usually the case that you could always use a few more emeralds in order to be able to buy a few more potions. And so I want to make it so that even later in the map, these different random loot chests are still kind of incrementally valuable. Obviously, with the bonus explorer monument, it's also the case that each type of random loot chest has a different color of stained glass in it. And so if you're trying to complete the bonus monument, you want to be able to get all these different colors of stained glass, and so that's more motivation to explore and find more of these chests, which will both allow you to complete that monument, as well as give you little incremental bits of other gear and blocks and food and different things that might be useful for the player. All of this, the bonus monument, the teleporters, all of these things are structured not so much around giving the player more stuff as giving the player a reason to explore the world so that they will find the various dungeons in the world and find the various loot chests so that they can have the enjoyment of finding those things, as well as just being able to map out more of the world and see all there is to see in the map, because there's lots of content in this map, and the nature of the map with having multiple dungeons kind of scattered across the map and you don't need to visit them all is that people aren't going to visit the entire map, but there are lots of interesting things to find, and so I want to encourage people to find as much of it as they can. And so these are all different ways that I use loot as an incentive in order to get the player to explore. Next, let's talk about dungeons. There are a number of different types of dungeons in this game, and let's go through one by one. The first one that players are likely to encounter is a normal vanilla mossy cobblestone spawner that is like this. In order to spice things up, it's the case that there's not one mob spawner, but 2. Basically, if there was a spider spawner originally, I add a skeleton spawner to it, and if there was some other type of spawner originally, then I add a cave spider spawner to it. And so that makes the spawner itself more challenging, especially by virtue of the fact that this would be one of the things that players would find in the very early game. And so that does make things very challenging. But at the same time, it has really good rewards in terms of all the loot that you'll find here, in terms of what might perhaps be your first bit of cobblestone, as well as the experience and drops that you could get from fighting the monsters that come out of these particular spawners. And if you wanted to turn the spawner into a spawn trap and farm mobs, you're welcome to do so. I haven't seen that many people do it. But once again, if you want extra loot, I want the players to have opportunities to get extra loot. And it's actually the case that those mob spawners spawn mobs more quickly than the default mobs that one normally finds in a mob spawner in Minecraft. And so whereas I think a normal mob spawner spawns a fresh set of mobs every 10 to 40 seconds, the mobs that you find in those vanilla dungeons in vanilla Swirl CTM spawn new mobs every 10 to 20 seconds. So if you do turn it into a mob spawner, it will be a very productive mob spawner because it's going to spawn a lot of mobs really quickly. Here we are, the green beacon. I talked about this a tiny bit in the previous episode, but the original idea for this whole map kind of came about as a result of me watching two different things. One is I was watching playthroughs of 3-2's Eventide Trance after I had played through it, which was a fun map that kind of got me back into CTMs at the end of 1.8 as a lot of the new 1.9 command block stuff was coming out, and I was doing stuff with my own kind of command block programming and other Minecraft map programming stuff. And the other is I was rewatching Zisto play Vex's Inferno Mines, and in the lush ruins of Inferno Mines, Vex's map, there was an area where basically he took a section of Minecraft terrain that had mine shafts in it and did block substitution to basically turn it into a kind of crazy cavey area that had lots of spawners and loot chests and things. And occasionally in that area, there were also lapis blocks, basically a string of lapis blocks, kind of like we have the redstone ore blocks that are going through here, which basically leads you down a tunnel in a certain direction to eventually bring you to a loot chest that had some good loot. And I saw that and I was like, I know how I could do that with vanilla Minecraft caves. Rather than having to place any of the lapis blocks on my own, I happen to know algorithms for connected components of air in order to figure out where the caves are, and shortest and longest path algorithms that I can use in order to find a place that starts at the surface and goes all the way down to the lava layer, for example. And so I can actually find a path and programmatically compute paths through the caves and leave a little trail. And when I decided I wanted to leave a little trail, I chose to do it using redstone ore rather than lapis blocks like Vex did in Inferno Mines, specifically because I wanted the affordance that redstone blocks give, which is, oops, I'm inside a block here. Let me dig my way out or just find my way back out really quick. Which is, if things are dark and you are trying to go through a dark cave and kind of trace the path, I guess I will go ahead and also give myself some torches on the bar so that I can light things up a little bit. But basically, you will notice that mobs start falling on the redstone and walk along the redstone path, and whenever you touch redstone ore, it lights up and gives off some light. And so as a result, this area that used to be completely dark now has a little bit of light being given off whenever these zombies are walking around on the redstone ore and lighting it up. And so that means even when you're in a dark section of cave, looking ahead, trying to figure out where the redstone path goes, since there are likely to be many spawners along the redstone path, mobs will be walking around on the redstone and you'll be able to see it from afar even when the thing isn't lit up. So that's why I chose that particular block. The algorithms I'll talk about probably in the future in more depth when I talk about the actual implementation and programming that went into the map. But basically, it picks a long, winding path through a natural cave system of Minecraft and puts spawners in various places along the path, and eventually leads you, through a gauntlet of spawners down to the loot box at the end. And in the particular case of the green beacon, it's also the case. Why don't I go back into spectator mode and have my night vision turned back on? It's often the case that while there is a path that takes you to the loot box at the end, there are also going to be various side paths. Let's see, where did this originally come in? Right, so we came in over here, and even though it branches to the left in order to go the correct way to the final loot box, it also branches to the right over to this little dead-end chest that says dead end, turn back and try again. And so there's actually a number of branching paths. Just like normal Minecraft cave systems often branch in a bunch of different directions, I take advantage of that, and while I have one main goal that I'm going towards, along the way there'll be various spurs where I have the redstone path branch off in different directions that are dead ends, both to kind of like set the player back and make them feel like they have to explore a bit of the cave system, but also, once again, to give them rewards for exploring, even if they kind of happen to go the wrong way at a particular moment in time. And yeah, basically, I started programming up an algorithm just to like draw the redstone paths through the cave system. And once I had managed to do that, I was convinced, wow, if I just put some spawners along here, this could be a really interesting and fun dungeon to go and play through. And so that was kind of the original impetus for the map. I had been doing some map making, and I had kind of CTM on the brain, and I saw Vex's Lush Ruins, which did something kind of similar, but with manually placed lapis blocks to bring you to particular paths. And I was like, I can programmatically go and do this with any Minecraft cave system of a certain size. And so, yeah, that became the idea for the green beacon and all of these little redstone paths. And yeah, like I said, I'll talk about the implementation and more details of the algorithms that go into actually coding that up, perhaps in a future video. But that is the first major dungeon, and I really enjoyed this dungeon. I actually enjoyed it so much that when I originally made this map and I was trying to decide what I wanted for the different dungeons and different areas, I thought that this was the best dungeon of the bunch. I'm not sure that I think that anymore, but in the original implementation, when I was originally playing this, like back in November and December of last year, I thought that of the three main dungeon types, this one, the Cobweb Flat Red Beacon, and the Mountain Peaks, I thought that this was the strongest and most fun to play, and so I decided rather than have this only be at the beginning of the map, I would use it to bookend things, and at the end of the map, I would have another dungeon that just had more spawners with harder enemies, but was the same type of map that brought you through the cave system, and that's the Purple Beacon. I'm not sure if I would make the same choice today, but that's why there's actually two different cave dungeons, one at the beginning of the map and one at the end of the map. It's because I thought it was so good. I wanted people to enjoy that at the end of the map so that as they're finishing the map, they would have that enjoyable experience. Now let's move on to the next major dungeon, the Red Beacon area with all the cobwebs. Ironically, just as I said, the green dungeon I thought was the strongest at the beginning. The red dungeon, at least with my original implementation, I thought was the least good of the dungeons that I had implemented, and I thought it was the least fun. And it's interesting because with most of the feedback, this is actually a dungeon that, while many people found frustrating and is definitely, I think, one of the hardest and kind of like turning points of the map, it was also one of the dungeons that people enjoyed the most. And it's definitely gotten a whole lot better over time. But basically with this dungeon, the algorithm just tries to find a flat area on the map that's a certain distance away from spawn. And it places the loot box in the center and places down a big assortment of random spawners and cobwebs. It originally was the case that there were then also just a few random redstone torches to give some ambiance to the area, but people with the bedrock ceiling and it being nighttime, people were having a hard time. In addition to giving the infinite seeing eyes that you could use night vision to see things better, I also changed the algorithm so that it always puts a redstone torch on top of each spawner, just to make it easier to see where all the spawners are. Even if you don't have the night vision eye or any other kind of affordances like that. And yeah, basically it gives enough light that you can kind of like see some things, but doesn't give enough light that it's going to prevent mobs from spawning. And so that's a nice way to do that. And also, red light just kind of like gives a nice ominous feel to this area. And yeah, it's pretty simple in terms of like an algorithm to create a dungeon, but it ends up being quite effective at killing people and frustrating people, and also making people feel very successful once they do manage to get it and get the loot, using a variety of different strategies. The main mobs who are here, cave spiders and witches, are among the main mobs, and that's because I wanted to apply some damage over time so that I would be repelling people who tried to come here before the green beacon. Once again, I was trying to make this area hard enough that people who hadn't completed the green beacon wouldn't be tempted to sequence break and try to get the red beacon loot first. Inside the green beacon, you definitely get some protection armor, and protection is the main thing that you need to overcome the poison of the cave spiders and the witches, as well as some protection or fire protection to deal with the blazes once you get inside the center of the area. And yeah, the cobwebs are actually one of the main threats. Sometimes people don't realize that early on. And if you don't break cobwebs along the way, unless you're very, very good, you're likely to get stuck in cobwebs, and then all the mobs who are spawning around you will come eat your face and you will die. And so it can be very useful to break the cobwebs. And I've only seen one person, I think, do it, but I give you lots of Efficiency 5 books, and by the time you're attacking this dungeon, you'll have lots of iron. You can put Efficiency 5 on shears. Actually, let's try it out really quick. All right, so that I can try this in survival mode, I'm just going to put the difficulty on peaceful so we won't have any mob spawning. But here's what happens when you try to break cobwebs with shears while you're in survival mode. It takes about so long. I think it's about the same rate as trying to cut through them with an iron sword or a diamond sword. And it's reasonably quick. But if instead we use some Efficiency 5 shears, which are something that players could easily obtain at this point, it's much faster. And so if you want to get through the cobwebs really quickly in this area, as well as I think even if you get stuck in them, it's also much faster than get back out as compared to using a sword or using some shears if you get stuck in the cobwebs. I think that's actually the major thing, because it is likely that you'll get stuck, but it can still be very quick for getting you unstuck. And so that's a strategy that I hadn't even thought of myself. But I think it was Chaos who showed that off in one of his videos, and I thought it was a very good strategy. So that's one way that you could deal with the cobwebs in this area and kind of keep yourself protected. A number of people use water buckets. The cobwebs are specifically placed. Some of them are on the ground, but some of them are a little bit up in the air, so that you can't just dump a water bucket and have it destroy all the cobwebs. There will still be threats. And also, if you do dump a water bucket, obviously you're going to potentially knock out some torchlight unless you're using glowstone to light up this area. Glowstone is actually a very good strategy in this area as well. In any case, it's a very kind of simple dungeon concept that was relatively straightforward to implement. The hard part was definitely figuring out the right size, frequency of spawners and cobwebs to make it challenging but doable for players. This dungeon is a little bit of a grind because it is a very large area that you kind of have to work your way into unless you use some very clever tactics. But once again, with a lot of the feedback I've gotten, this is actually a lot of people's favorite dungeon. Next up, there's the Mountain Peak dungeon, and it's actually implemented very similarly to the Cobweb dungeon, which is effectively the algorithm finds an interesting area. In this case, kind of a dome-shaped mountain is the ideal thing that my algorithms are looking for. And yeah, we're still on peaceful, so we're not going to be spawning mobs, so it won't get loud with all the ghasts. And then randomly goes and places some spawners kind of on the terrain throughout the area. It also adds some redstone torches to add some kind of like lighting, both so the player can see a little bit better what's going on, as well as just to make it look, red and intimidating. And it's got the loot chest at the top. In this case, the ceiling is low and kind of right above the loot chest, and that's so that people cannot so easily kind of throw an ender pearl from afar and just kind of like land it on top of the chest and break in from the top very easily, or so that people can't just kind of like build across above the top and just try to drop in. And yeah, in more recent versions of the map, it's also harder to kind of tunnel underneath. Sometimes the mountain is connected to part of a larger mountain system, and so sometimes you can kind of tunnel in from the side. And so just like underneath the Cobweb dungeon, I've added more obsidian and silverfish blocks underneath the terrain inside here, just to dissuade people from trying to tunnel on through in order to get here, so they'll take the fun path. Despite having a lot of spawners and having to fight uphill, and I'll actually come back to uphill in just a moment, a lot of people find this area to be a little bit easier than the Cobweb dungeon. Back in the March version of the map, this actually contained a monument block, and I changed it so this one no longer contains a monument block. The monument block got moved back into the first screen beacon, which is better for a variety of reasons. But also just because the level of gear that you're at often makes this area a little bit easier. I also made the kind of spawner and bedrock ceiling a little bit bigger on this compared to the March maps to make it a little bit more difficult. But it's still the case for the level of gear that people are at that this area is actually often easier to get to, which is fine. There's no monument block here now. It's just part of the step in order to get you to the hidden elytra chest with the mysterious divining rod. And yeah, it looks scary, and the fact that there's blazes and gas that can even spawn on the perimeter. I find that ghasts are actually not an awful enemy, even in the early game, but I find that they tend to like scare players off. And so gas typically, I find, don't deal a whole lot of damage to players unless they're in a place that they're going to fall off of something and like fall in lava or something like that. but players tend to be scared of ghasts in the early game, I find. And so ghasts are mostly used as a way to kind of dissuade the player from coming here early. And also they're just kind of a good way to defend this area. I mentioned that the mountain kind of like forces you to fight uphill, which is difficult. When I originally came up with ideas for different dungeons, I had 3 good ideas. There was the cave system one, there is the flat cobweb one, and there is the mountain peak one. And the reason that I chose to put them in the order that I chose to put them is in the caves, you start at the surface and you kind of work your way down. And it's often the case in CTM maps that it's easiest to fight top down. If you start from the top and work your way down, it's easy. If you start at the bottom and work your way up, it's hard because mobs are falling on your head and you might fall at the end. And so the green dungeon kind of goes down into the earth. The red beacon dungeon, which is in the middle, has you just traveling flat across, so there's no danger of fall damage, and you can kind of like see everything that's going on, but mobs are going to spawn ahead of you and come towards you. And finally, the mountain dungeon, you kind of have to fight uphill, and so it's the place that mobs can knock you off, and you'll fall back down and take fall damage. Mobs are spawning above you and kind of falling on your head. You're trying to place blocks and find kind of a staircase or a good way to get up, and so the idea is down was easy, flat across was medium, and going uphill was difficult. And so that's the reason that the green was first and the red was second and the mountain was third of the 3 different dungeon types. And then I just tried to make the number and types of spawners appropriate for the levels of gear that the player had in order to make it a good challenge, but definitely something that you could conquer. Finally, the purple beacon is very much like the green beacon. It's another one of these redstone paths through a cave system. However, it is longer and has more spawners with more difficult mobs. Unlike the green beacon, there are no side paths. In the green beacon, sometimes the redstone path would branch, and one branch would take you eventually to the loot box, whereas another one would just take you off on a little side path that would end in a dead-end chest and give you some emeralds. There's no reason in the final dungeon to give players loot other than the final monument block, in my opinion, because they already have gotten all the loot and they won't be able to use it to conquer any further areas. And so I didn't have any side paths in this dungeon. There's just a single path, so you can't get lost. You have to follow it in order to, get through all of the spawners. But eventually you will find your way to the loot box, wherever it happens to be in this particular dungeon, and get the final monument block there. And so there's not a whole lot more to say about the purple beacon. It's pretty similar to the green. I don't know where the time goes. I've talked about loot, I've talked about the dungeons, and I think this is probably a good place to call it for this episode. In a future episode, I will continue to talk about some other design aspects of vanilla Swirl CTM maps that I've made. I hope, as always, that you guys are having a great day, you're enjoying these videos, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye-bye.